Thanks for tuning in. I'm Scott Walter, and today our special guest is Bryan Bernys from the Leadership Institute to discuss how the left maintains control of campus politics. This is the InfluenceWatch podcast. When most college students pay their tuition bill, they see a line item for mandatory student fees. While each student may not pay much, the combined fees from all students can add up to a massive sum, and that money goes toward campus organizations that can engage powerfully in political activism. According to an exposé on student fees at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that was done by the Leadership Institute's campusreform.org news site, students at that school are expected to pay over $50 million in student fees in 2018. While the fees at public universities can't go to explicitly political groups, such as college Republicans or Democrats, they can go to heavily politicized advocacy groups, such as socialist, feminist, or racial or ethnic identity groups. Campus Reform found that at UW-Madison, left-leaning groups received 20 times the funding of right-leaning groups. Well, Bryan, first of all, thanks so much for joining us. And I should say that our regular co-host here, Michael Watson, still on paternity leave, upsetting the environmentalists by adding more human beings to the earth. And we are here, as usual, in our Leadership Institute studios that we are happy to use. And it's great to have you from Leadership Institute. Tell us a little bit about LI and what LI has done on the student fee issue.
Sure. So one of the programs that we run is an outreach initiative to conservative college students. We do several trainings and several organizational things to help them form student student groups on their chapters when whatever ideas sports that they believe in. So for example, we support pro-life groups, pro-gun groups, Young Americans for Liberty groups, everything in the conservative spectrum, if you will. We have other products training, and then we also, as you cited, has Campus Reform, that is the news site for these groups. Because one of the things that we've noticed over the years was all the bias, in ways these universities try to intimidate, indoctrinate, and shut down conservative groups on college campuses, and there needed an outlet to do that, and that's why Campus Reform is there. But a common reoccurring theme is these groups complaining that universities won't officially recognize them, or give them equal funding. And that's kind of what you see here. Just in general, I think a lot of these students are complaining about the overall cost of higher education and how high some of these student fees are. And in many cases, they're forced to pay into a mandatory fee that supports things they don't believe in.
Sure. Well, how big of an issue is this nationwide? Do we have a rough idea of how much money is going into these student fees from millions of college students?
Because we have so many different colleges out there, and there's private colleges and there's public colleges, and each one and each system, acts differently. It's really hard to put an exact figure, on the student fee problem, but you're talking about millions. I mean, in one school alone, you're talking about $20 million, in fees. And if you just times that out by the more than 2,000, colleges that we have in this country, you can see how large scale this is.
It sounds like it's probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yes. It is.
Which, if one were going to set up a political movement and knew that you would have access to hundreds of millions of dollars, you might be fairly confident about the capacity of that large movement.
And one of the things is, it's not that, conservative student groups don't get any funding. There are certainly, universities that allow these groups to have funding, but in the vast majority, of college campuses out there, conservatives are the minority on college campuses. And in many cases, some or most of the student funding decisions are made by the student governments, which are usually run by progressive or liberal students. And as a result, these conservative groups are treated unfairly. And it's hard to build a majority on campus or get your message out and find others like you if you're being censored or denied access to the same funding as the other side has. Sure.
Well, how did the student fees start? I mean, was there a legitimate reason to create the student fees as part of kids' tuition bills?
Well, I mean, I think like, anything, any other thing you join in life, whether you join a gym or a cell phone, there's always a hidden fee or a tax, or something else. Let's be honest what these student fees are. In some ways, they're a tax on these students. And as universities grew and expanded, and in some case, not always for the good, I think one thing we've seen, at campus reform and others is universities nowadays seem to be more into the lifestyle experience or entertainment than they are in education. And you've got to fund that somehow. To build the lazy rivers and the rock climbing walls and the latest, dorm things, that has to be funded. And this is a way to do it through a mandatory student fee. But the real question I think we as students, parents, and taxpayers, might have to start looking into is, how is this money being spent? And is it really going to advance the purpose of higher education and prepare these students for jobs in the real world?
That seems like a fair question, especially since what you're really saying is, what return are you going to get on your $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 investment in college education?
Right, and one of the things I think that this problem has gotten so bad over the years, or these fees have hiked up so much, is because for the average student, that just comes out of high school, what is the difference if you're paying $20,000 a year, in tuition, or $50,000? Either way, it's an unsurmountable debt that you're not used to, and you have a student loan or a grant or something else that's going to cover it. And the thing is, well, I'll worry about this 4 years from now. Well, 4 years later, that couple $1,000s is now $100,000, and if you're $100,000 in debt, what is $1,000 here or there? And that's how they're doing this. But so I do think we have to start looking at, college in terms of what career path does a student want to go down? And when they graduate, what income can they expect to make? And in some decisions, maybe that decides whether they go to college A or college B, because if you're only going to make $40,000 a year in your chosen field, how are you ever going to pay off $100,000 in debt over the year and then still do all the things that these kids are going to want to do as adults, possibly get married, have a house, save for retirement, all those other costs?
Yep. Well, let's talk about some of the specific groups that are getting a little fat off of these student fees that, as you say, the average student, when he sees his itemized bill, this is probably less than he's spending for books, so it may not even much less than he's spending for tuition, so it may not seem that big of a deal. Or to a parent who's looking at that same bill and groaning, it's not a very big part of it, but it might be one of the least justified parts of it. So some of the groups that the study that College Reform did noted were things like sex out loud. What can you tell us about that?
This is one of, there are a lot of things that happen at college, campuses like Sex Out Loud. A number of universities do things that they call, sex weeks. There's a lot of programming that comes out of the LGBTQ centers or designed to make, sexual identity, more inclusive on campus. But, this is one where, they will take a small amount, a couple dollars here or there. In this case, I think it was somewhere around $77,000, for programming. And it varies from campus to campus, but some of them have sex toy parties or safe sex practices or bring strippers or other people, to the campus to give their perspective on society, and things like that. But the real question, again, it goes back to is, I'm not sure exactly how a program like this helps prepare, people for the real world. It seems like this is another example of universities now are more into catering to, the students' need, and they're more interested in preparing students for the bedroom than the boardroom. And I don't know that that's what, you or I or any other parent out there sends their kid to college to learn.
Yes, one also wonders, is it really necessary? Does it take a $77,000 subsidy from student fees to get college students to talk about sex? I suspect not.
Right.
You could probably do that for a little less. Another group that receiving money, even more money than that, apparently, was the university's chapter of MECHA, and I'm not sure how they pronounce the acronym itself, MECHA. But it's Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. And that sounds like a more overtly political group that's getting lots of money.
Yeah, I would say this is a more progressive group. It's probably funded through a diversity center like that. It does represent in many cases, a diversity group, on college campuses. But you then have to look into the type of programming they're doing. If a quick glance at this group's, Facebook page will tell you that they hosted an event called, Men Are Trash. And how being male is bad on campus, or they're very big supporters at some universities of the DREAM Act, and this is part of the groups that, are attacking ICE agents on campus or banning ICE from campus, or, things of that nature. And so there are some questionable things on whether or not this should be even funded, especially when it happens at a state-funded university.
Yes, I noticed in this case, the Mecho, one of their gripes was that at Halloween time, they said that a mere law enforcement costume was intimidating, and they objected to that.
Sure. I mean, and this has been going on college campuses for a while as part of the culture war, the political correctness movement. Everybody's offended whether it's, a law enforcement costume or, a costume of a nun or religious figure or a Native American Indian, things like that. And it seems like we have this disturbing trend, on college campuses developing that your right as a student or as a human not to be offended is more important than a free speech right of somebody else. I don't know how, again, that translates in the real world, because there are things that I experience every single day, watching TV, listening to radio, walking on the street, that offend me. And it's not like I'm calling up ABC or NBC and saying that we have to remove all those hosts from the show because I was offended, by something. That I don't know how you can, exercise your free speech in this society and say what you believe and not offend somebody. So
yes, and as you say, lots of people will get out in the real world, the business world, outside of college campus without deputy assistant associate deans of diversity, and discover that people don't care too much whether they were offended by somebody else who happened to disagree with them.
Right.
Speaking of the campus-funded efforts to divide people along ethnic and religious and racial and ethnic lines, the study also found groups like the Queer Student Center and Feminist Student Activist Collective groups, and also pure racial groups like Black or Asian American, also getting this kind of funding.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the new university, environment where we want to celebrate diversity and different viewpoints, which I think is great. I mean, every college they should stick to the true intellectual diversity and bring in multiple viewpoints on college camps or anything. I think the problem that we see with this, though, is that how it's practiced in reality on a lot of college campuses is that we only want diversity when it agrees with our liberal or progressive agenda. And this is why over the past couple of years, you've seen these violent outbursts when conservatives come to college campus and speak, because somehow that's not part of the diversity conversation. That point can't be recognized on campus because it offends, some of the liberal and the progressives. I think the other dangerous trend that you see in this diversity movement is that are saying that we're doing this in the name of inclusivity to bring everybody together, and make sure that everybody's on an equal playing field. But in reality, what's happening is we have these special, student centers or programs for one group based on sexual orientation, one group based on, race, or ethnicity. And then we see this going into almost dividing people because we're pitting one group and saying it's better than the rest. And the scary thing is, in some college campuses, you've seen now where there are dorms that are, or this single sexual orientation only dorm, or this single, a race only dorm. It's like we're going back to segregation. And that seems to be a very disturbing trend.
It's pretty odd that Bull Connor gets to have the last laugh about segregation on campus. You also have groups that are more obviously, directly, purely political. The Public Interest Research Group, which you can go to InfluenceWatch.org and find out more about their history. But for our listeners here, why don't you explain a bit about what they are? They don't have the smokescreen of, oh, well, we're making up for past injustices about this particular ethnic group or sexual orientation group, do they?
No, this is a group that was, founded by Ralph Nader and regularly promotes progressive colleges on college campuses, and in many cases lobbies, state legislatures for these causes. why this group is getting taxpayer funded, money, or in many cases student fees to do this, I don't know what role this plays. Surely the group, there are other progressive organizations or people out there that will fund it. It doesn't need to be siphoning the money off of, the higher education system. And I think that's one question that we have to ask ourselves is, why do we need all these student fees anyways? I mean, everybody is complaining about the cost of higher education, and rightly so. But there's, in a lot of cases, you're talking about hundreds or thousands of dollars in student fees that we could eliminate if we just went back to, focusing on the books and getting a degree and how to get a job in the real world, rather than all these other entertainment, and societal causes that we're, doing on college campuses.
Yes, it definitely seems odd. Although to give Mr. Nader credit for his cunning, I think this was probably one of the original groups designed precisely to exploit the possibility of snagging student fees without anybody noticing. Its history goes a good number of years back, and in a twisted kind of way. At least they were ingenious to think, oh, here's free money, easy free money for us. And we get to both indoctrinate students' thinking, and we get to train activists that we can then use as foot soldiers for our various political causes. There are some conservative groups that receive funding from student fees as well. Is that right?
Yeah, like I said when we began the conversation, it's not fair to say that conservative students don't get any money. But, as the minority, on college campuses, they certainly aren't in as large of numbers. And I don't think it's fair to say on a lot of college campuses, these conservative groups have the same backing from the professors, the administration, that other groups do. So there are groups out there. Many of them get student, funding, and many of the conservative groups that we work with that don't get conservative funding still exist. Maybe they're not officially recognized, by the university, but they still hold their own meetings, they still do their own programming, and they receive, the funding for that from other outside groups. Either they learn to raise their own money from individuals, or they, receive, help and support from groups like the Leadership Institute, Young Americans for Freedom, Young Americans for Liberty, Turning Point USA, a number of these groups, that are active on college campuses.
Are there any other groups you want to throw out for our listeners that they should know about?
I mean, there are a lot of groups, out there on college campuses that are taking place. I don't know, and I think we want an environment where we want more groups. And, there's no reason why you can't have 12 different, conservative or libertarian-leaning, groups, on a college campus. I think one of the dangerous trends that we see, though, is you have a climate right now where people say that, oh, Turning Point supports or is supportive of President, Donald Trump. Therefore, every Turning Point member and Republican is either a racist, a bigot, or whatever else. And you see these student governments trying to pass initiatives to say they have no right to organize on campus, they have no right to student funding. And then now we're seeing the censorship or suppression of conservative speech on college campuses, which is a dangerous trend that's starting to pop up, around the country that we're regularly tracking on campusreform.org.
That's you mentioned earlier the intellectual diversity. I mean, it's yet again this just incredible paradox that people whose every other word is diversity, and the average campus now has 10 or 20 administrators with diversity and inclusion in their official titles, and yet when the most important thing that should be going on a campus, college campus, is thought, the idea of diversity in thought is actually verboten. And what we want to have is a variety of sexual orientations and genders and races and ethnicities who all think the identical thoughts with no diversity there.
Yeah, I mean, from a institutional level, the faculty and the administrators believe in freedom of speech when it applies to them. So it's their slogan, or message or mantra seems to be free speech for me, but not for thee. As soon as it crosses into something that they don't agree with, they find a way to label it a hate group, or say that it's dangerous, and shut it down. And I think what we really need to do is just have more dialogue on all of these, topics on campus so that we are training and preparing a generation of college kids that can actually critically think, form their own decisions, and go on into the workforce. The danger, that we're developing here is that the next generation of elected officials, of CEOs, governors out there has been exposed throughout their entire college career to only one point of view and doesn't see both sides of the story and can't critically think, and analyze. I mean, what is the safe space generation going to do when they go in the real world and they hear something offensive? Are they going to crawl under their desks? Are they going to call the HR department and, try to file a trigger warning? I just don't know where this is going, and I don't know that it's healthy.
Yes, I have a great story from I heard it from a conservative professor, but the story involves one of his left-wing colleagues. The colleague was teaching an American government course, and the idea was that it was an American government course that was going to talk about great political controversies in the history of America. So, understandably, if you're going to talk about those controversies, you have to have some idea about, okay, well, there was a controversy over this subject and people had different views, and let's start with what their two views were, and then we'll learn more about how the controversy developed. Well, so here's what the left-wing professor found. He was opening his class up, and it was going to be on abortion. Now, obviously, big controversial issue in American history. And he said, okay, well, let's first just get on the table what the two sides believe. Who here can explain to me what the pro-life view is on abortion? And the room was silent. He said, no, come on, just, I'm not saying you agree with it or anything, just, I don't agree with it, but just we got to start by explaining what's that side of this issue. Total silence. Apparently there wasn't a kid in the room that either knew or was willing to admit he knew what that view was. So the left-wing professor groaned and said, okay, well, here's, the gist of what the pro-life argument would be. And he just rattles off a few simple talking points. And a girl in the front row starts weeping. And he's baffled, like, well, what's the matter? And she says, I have no idea how to respond to any of that. She was not at all pro-life. She wasn't feeling guilty over some abortion that she had. She was weeping because she was utterly ignorant of what the other side of her own position might be, and she was terribly distraught that because she was so ignorant, she couldn't respond to it and defend her own position. Now, that's a pathetic.
Well, and I would say that I think you and I can both agree she's not alone. There are probably several students like that. And the scary thought should be is, what happens in 15, 20 years when that student is elected as a member of Congress, or that student, is a governor, or, runs for president or something like that? That is the type of person that we all want making decisions for all of us. And this is, one of the ways in which I think the American higher education system is now failing, our students.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to touch on that you brought up as well, and that is this, we've begun to hear the argument that, like, your speech, which I disagree with, hurts me because I disagree with it. I'm hurt by your speech. You've done violence to me by saying something that I disagree with. And that was puzzling to me for a while because, like, no, it isn't violence to express an idea that someone else disagrees with. I mean, in and of itself, that's simply not violence. But I began to suspect, however, that when you start, that the reason for making this bizarre argument that speech by itself is violence is that it can let you then flip things around and say, okay, these Antifa thugs here who are violent, their violence is just speech.
Yes.
Your speech is violence, and my violence is speech.
Yeah, it's justifying, this crazy, reaction there. And we have to be, careful where we let this, go, because we are not fully educating people. And I think the other disturbing trend you see is recently poll after poll that comes out and asks students about the First Amendment. They don't know what the First Amendment actually means, and they don't know what speech is protected and what speech not. And that's a very dangerous thing. We're not even teaching basic civics and history anymore, I don't even know if we're doing it in high school anymore, but it's definitely, they lose it when they go to college.
Yeah, well, groups like Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI, and ACTA, the American College of Trustees and Alumni, have done wonderful polls where they ask people simple civics questions, and they find how pathetically high school kids and college kids perform. And my personal favorite is that at very prestigious universities like Duke, when they go and they test freshmen and seniors, they discover that in many places, the seniors are even more ignorant than the freshmen, which is to say, what little they came in knowing as freshmen, a lot of it got lost because, of course, in their 4 years, for hundreds of thousands of dollars. They didn't get even the most basic things. And so pathetic questions like, what are the three branches of government, are simply beyond their capacity.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we cover every day at the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform is this level of indoctrination that these kids in many cases are, top performers in great high schools around the country. They go to college, they're paying, $30, $40, $50, $100,000 for this education, and they come out worse off on the other end because they have been so indoctrinated. They have only learned one side of the story, and they have been, it's been so jammed down their throat that if you don't, agree with this point of view, you are somehow a monster.
Well, let's go back to the
Sure.
to speaking of college reform. Let's go back to the actual study of student fees that it did that's so valuable. We've talked about some of the groups that get money from this. But let's talk about some of the actual entities and programs that got funding on campus.
Okay.
I see that the Boynton Health Facility there at UW got a very large sum of money. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, this is one of many ones. Again, they got they charge us for an fee, and when you charge it out by 50,000 students or so, it ends up being millions of dollars. And I think in this one, if I remember correctly, it was the fee would also cover hormone therapy, IUDs, birth control, and everything else. And as you can imagine, at least we hear from conservative students across country all the time that don't agree with a fee like this. They don't necessarily agree based on their personal religious views or otherwise that they should be automatically paying for everybody to have birth control or hormone therapy, or whatever else it is. It's also kind of ironic because under the current climate, a number of these college kids still are on their parents' insurance and don't need this fee anyways, yet we're charging everybody this fee and wrapping it up. I mean, Duke University, I think, had another one in 2003 where they, were funding any students' gender reassignment surgery, and things of that nature. And there are a lot of questions. Is this the university's role to fund this?
Sure. Now, at UC Berkeley, campus reform talked about locker rooms, and this could be and it was for gender neutral locker rooms. Now,
Correct.
We could certainly understand that there could be a place for having some facility like this, but again, when it's easy, free money and other people's money, we don't tend to spend that very carefully, do we?
No, and this is like many things I think that you guys covered InfluenceWatch that the government does. I think we're looking at a multi-million-dollar bathroom. Now, I think there's a lot of places where you could install a bathroom for much less. And so this is just kind of how this gets out of control. I guess it's a couple cents here, $1 here by, a few students. But when you add it up, it's a large pot of money. And suddenly they have more money than they know what, to do with. There are other examples, that we covered at, campus reform. For example, the University of New England has a diversity leadership scholarship certificate that if you are a student and you complete 20 hours of programming, they give you this certificate in social justice programming. Now, every student pays into student fees, and they pay for this thing. And as part of the certificate, not only do you have to go to some seminars, but you also have to support the university's other diversity, programs, the LGBTQ, center, a lot of the, other diversity series lecture, series, and the safe space workshops. Now, there are students that are like, this is crazy. One, they don't agree with the social justice movement, in general, or especially the safe space initiatives, but now they're funding it for everybody, and we're somehow giving these people certificates in it. This is just, another way of doing this. Now, I will say, it isn't all bad. There are some students out there that have seen the problem and are trying to rise to the occasion. There is a group of conservative students, like, for example, last, academic year at Rutgers University that read the fine print in the student fees and realized that the daily student newspaper at Rutgers gets majority of their funding from the student fees. There is a $11.25 student fee that every student pays, but this is an opt-in fee. The only way to get out of this fee, you can, and this is what these students try to do, they try to educate the student body on what this fee was and how to get out of it. But the only way to get out of this fee is you have to do it prior to paying your tuition, and you must email the publication in order to receive, a refund. That's a very complicated process. And again, when you're a student and you're getting your financial, your loan, your financial aid check or whatever it is, and you're writing a fee, for, somewhere like $10,000 or more, are you really looking at the details of the $11.25 fee? And more or less, you have to either go in and subtract that amount from the overall check you pay, or email the publication and say, would you please refund, my student fee? And I don't know how many of those emails even got returned, or processed. And that's how this process is now. But let's just take that out. The Rutgers student body is somewhere, into 40, 50,000, students. So you take that $11.25 fee per semester divided by the students, you're talking about over $1 million a year. Over $1 million a year is funding a student paper that in many cases, a lot of students aren't reading. This is crazy. If the paper is successful and needed on campus, there should be a way that they can sell copies or sell sponsorship,
or advertising.
Right. Or advertising thing. But every student on campus is paying the $11.25 for a paper that I'm sure the majority of them don't read. And this is how we get, to this point.
Well, let's step back here and look at the bigger question. Should the fees just be eliminated completely? What do you think is the best way for them to be handled?
I mean, this has always confused me because I certainly understand that there are certain things that the student body needs. Buildings, salaries, things like that. But I thought that's what you were paying when you set a tuition price. I thought your tuition was paying for the facilities on campus to pay the teachers, and everything else. What these fees have become, though, in many cases, is backdoor ways for universities to raise more money. So you've seen over the years, state legislatures that have an influence on the cost of tuition, or governors say, that's it, we're going to try to solve this problem, we're going to freeze tuition. That's great. They freeze tuition, but what the university doesn't stop spending. So what they do is just enact these fees, on the backside. So yeah, in many cases, I think we should eliminate these because remember what these are funding a bunch of things that might not be needed on campus or can be solved by the free market. They're funding, for example, the student gym, on campus that I'm sure not every student uses. And in some cases, these gym fees are mandatory $50 a semester fees. If there is that much of a need for a gym on campus, I'm sure that Gold's Gym or Planet Fitness would have no problem building a gym right off site and students can join it, as they need. And that's a free market solution. And that gym probably will have better equipment and be kept more up to date with the latest fitness technology because they want to stay in business. Some of the other fees we saw in the studies that we did were, I think there was the Bulldog taxi at one of them. A taxi service that cut the rate in half for students to come home from the bar at the end of the night, to 50%. Most students didn't even know it existed. They're funding this fee and didn't use it. And I don't understand the need for this taxi system because it seems to me that Uber or Lyft have solved this problem. There's an economic and easy way to get home from the bar, afterwards, and the free market again has solved this problem. And so I think that's what we need to look for is there's a lot of, like many things in government, wasted spending here. And yes, I think it's great that we allow the First Amendment and freedom of association to flourish on college campus. And students should really be able to start just about any group they want. But if the group is needed on campus and there's enough demand for it, then these students can meet and use the facilities together or raise money privately or seek from private charities and nonprofits and their donations the money needed to bring speakers to campus, and things like that. I don't know that the student body or these students has to subsidize this. I think if you ask most college students out there, hey, would you like a couple of these speakers to come to campus or fund all these groups, or would you rather save $1,000 or more a year on your tuition? I think the majority of them would say they'd rather save the money.
Yep. If I'm a student on campus, are there things that I should be trying to do? One easy thing, it seems obvious to me, is that I should be demanding complete transparency about where the monies are going, because we all know from our college years, little cliques often will take over student government, and then they help they shovel the money to their pals. That may help to explain the huge disparities in what different groups are getting. And if that were completely transparent, people would be able to protest if it was outrageous, and probably the transparency would even deter some of the favoritism that's going on now.
Yeah, I think transparency is always a good thing, and this, and I would encourage all students, and this is one of the things that we try to support through Leadership of Campus Reform, is students will often say, look at the devil in the details, looking at what their student government's spending money on, or they are a part of student government and they have a problem, and they'll send us a tip or they'll want to write the story up, which is great. And I have one example of that is we got a tip, earlier this year from students at the The SUNY Albany, in New York, chapter, their student government spent $5,000 to send 6 members of the student government to a diversity conference in New Orleans during Mardi Gras. Now, the great thing about this and what made so many students on campus, mad is there also was the same conference. There was a meeting coming up in New York that they could have gone that wouldn't have involved all the plane flights, everything else. But when it got more disturbing and these students demanded some transparency and looked into what this $5,000 trip cost for this, they noticed, that was not a trip. There's just $5,000, I think, in spending in like hotel and taxi cab fees. Now, the majority of the Uber fees were not going from the hotel to the conference. They were going from the hotel to the French Quarter, and they were at nighttime. So the university and the student fees were most likely paying for these student government officers to have a great time at Mardi Gras and go bar hopping. That is not what the intention, I don't think, of those student fees when they were, taken from all the students was. And there was no control here. This would have been one. If there's a need to go to the diversity conference, okay, but why aren't you going to the one in your own state where presumably you would be networking with students around your own community and things like that, rather than going on what amounted to, it seems like here, a paid Mardi Gras vacation where these student government, officers had no problem voting in a fee to enrich themselves and create their own great experience. Well,
frankly, that sounds like great job training for future members of Congress.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Going on junkets around the world of no value but great expense. Thanks so much, Bryan, for joining us this week and for all of the great work that Leadership Institute and its campusreform.org news site has done on this issue. I hope that both students and state legislators will study all these reports carefully and think about how they can make things better on campus, because God knows campuses are not one of America's success stories.
Right, and thank you for having me. I'm happy to come on and talk about it, and I do think a key to this is going to be having students, taxpayers, and alumnus hold the universities accountable and hold their state legislators accountable. When it comes to the student fee issue, legislatures can have an influence and should. And anybody who's interested in this topic can continue to follow these stories at campusreform.org. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Bryan. That is our show for this week. If you're listening to us on iTunes or Stitcher, you should know that we broadcast a live video version of the podcast at 10 a.m. on Thursdays for Facebook Live and YouTube. You can find our pages by searching Capital Research Center. And if you're watching the video version, we encourage you to subscribe to the audio on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next week.